Oh, there we go. Welcome everybody. It's good to see so many of you on this morning. We have got a couple of great guests this morning. I'm really looking forward to this talk. We can see there on the screen that we've got Associate Professor Stephen Cobley and also Shaun Abbott on here from the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. Morning, guys.
Morning, Russ.
Really, thanks for joining us. It's great to be linked to the other side of the world by hook or by crook. I think it's probably by satellites these days, isn't it?
Yeah, it feels like that at the moment. Even if someone's down the other end of the street, it's still everything's online here.
and you guys that have been around for a while, I'll know of Steve Cobley. You'll know that he's from around our parts as well in Yorkshire. So it's great to welcome you on here, Steve.
Thanks a lot, Russ. Cheers.
So what we're going to do today, guys. Stephen's been working on a project. Multifaceted expertise in many areas of athlete development and also psychology. But they've been working on a project with Swimming Australia called Project H2 Grow, which is they're going to explain to you. But Steve, I was just wondering if you could just give us a quick whistle-stop tour of your career and what's got you to this point so far.
My background is in psychology mainly, but certainly been involved in a lot of work in skill acquisition, research, and then this project's taken me a lot more into looking at athlete development within a sporting context. But my background's probably more, you would say, in cricket and football, and not surprising given the background. I was up at Leeds Carnegie for 9-10 years before coming out here, so I've been out in Australia now for 10 years. And a lot of the research activities have continued, and involving work with rugby league, rowing, you keep going. But now this project's brought me into swimming, and over the last 4 or 5 years, we've had good working and a good partnership with Swimming Australia, and of course bumped into Jamie Salter in that time. So you can imagine 2 poms over here getting plenty of stick, and then. And then in 2015-16, along with the national coach Yako and the senior coaching team, they started a conversation with us about what athlete development and what kind of some of the issues we should be thinking about in Australian swimming. So that's the backdrop of how we got to here today. So it's a nice opportunity to tell you some of the things that we've been doing. Shaun's been involved as a PhD student, and he's going to be able to tell you about some of the work he's been doing over the last 3 years as well.
Brilliant. That's great. And also, guys, we've got Andrew Haley on here as well from the Tangland Trust School in Singapore that has been working with some of the stuff that Stephen and Shaun's been working on. And so, hi, Andrew. Nice to have you on board, and please feel free to chip in if you see any functional things that the coaches here might be able to find useful.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Ross. Thanks for putting this together.
No, it's thank you. It was actually Andrew that introduced me to Stephen and Shaun. So thanks for your input there. I really appreciate it. So Stephen, do you want to kick us off and get the discussion going?
Yeah, sure. So hopefully everyone can see the slides okay.
Yeah, looking good.
Excellent. Okay, so before I get going, I think it would be pretty remiss of me to not mention that what you're going to see and hear tonight and what we're going to talk about is not me or Shaun alone. It is part of a big team, and of course there's Jamie and these other colleagues on there that are listed, as well as people in Switzerland, folks in other parts of Swimming Australia, around Australia, which is, is a massive country. So we have to fly everywhere to catch up, meet up. So very grateful and very acknowledging. I want to make sure I'm very acknowledging of the broader team that is part of it. I just want to start by sort of giving you my kind of overview of athlete development. And it comes from me sort of being involved in writing and researching and as a coach, really, not necessarily in swimming, but certainly out there involved in coaching on the ground, just sort of thinking about what athlete development is and drawing upon what a lot of conversations and a lot of content of presentations, at least the conversation is about. And so I'm just providing you a definition here from one of our textbooks, which I'll shamelessly plug at the end. But it's essentially, if we're talking about athlete development, what are we trying to drive at? And for me, I think we're getting down to this kind of statement, and you can gladly correct me, gladly give me your input. It's nothing set in stone. It's just the idea of we're taking a person in a particular context. We're trying to understand where their present skills and capabilities are and their developmental stage is. And we're trying to look at all the multifactorial ways in which we can help them progress over time. And I say without deleterious consequences. And when I mean that, I mean that in terms of injury, and I mean that in terms of serious injury, I mean that in terms of psychological consequences. And of course, we don't want dropout and withdrawal. So, and I deliberately put that in just because sometimes as coaches, when we get up to that peaky end of performance, we sometimes forget about that, or we sometimes have to negotiate that quite carefully. And I also say multifaceted deliberately. I'll explain what I mean by multifaceted and also explain what I mean by non-linear, which means, obviously, as you know, as coaches, things don't happen in straight lines. They're often in very strange trajectories. Sometimes you have to go backwards before you go forwards, depending on what we're talking about. So if you kind of go with that definition, the challenge for coaches, in essence, is these kind of questions at the bottom. And I think a lot of coaches try and do the identification and the evaluation of skills, competencies, and capabilities in whatever ways we can, whatever instruments we've got at our disposal. Sometimes we want sports scientists, etc., to help us on that. But then the bit that I sometimes think that we're not so good at, and because we also don't have a lot of research data on it, is the change over time bit, which is what exactly, if you've got all the facets that are in front of you, which bits are you going to work on? When are you going to work on those? And how are you going to work on those? And how long does each of those facets take to develop? Because there are some things, as you know, skills can take a long time to develop. Some aren't. They can be quickly adjusted and manipulated. Then there's other aspects which will, like physiological changes, for example, from training programs. So when I mean multifaceted elements, here's an example of a diagram which might scare you at first, but I put this down as an example, and it's in my opening book chapter of our book in talent identification and development, and it's me trying to explain what do we mean by all the components that go into a performance. And I've taken an example here of a 100-meter freestyle swimmer, and through chatting with coaches, actually in Australia, this came about through me asking a lot of coaches about what are you trying to work on, when are you trying to work on, those questions that we had on the previous slide. And it was talking with some elite coaches, and they always came back to me and framed it in a way of, oh, we're working on this piece. This is what we're doing in this cycle. This cycle, we're working on this. And then I asked them outside, and so they were talking in jigsaw pieces, I think, without directly being explicit about it. They were trying to look at all the different components, and typically a lot of the elite coaches were working down on the bottom. They were working on the bottom left on physiological capacities. Are we okay? They were working on the bottom left on physiological capacities, but when I actually got them sat down and talking and having a conversation about what would go into a holistic performance, they would talk to me about all these other things as well. So these are the things, of course, we could put under biomechanics, technical capacities, psychological functioning, as well as recovery and injury prevention. And I'm not saying that's exhaustive in any way, it's just me trying to give you a pictorial diagram of all the pieces in the puzzle that you as a coach have to handle. And so when I'm talking about multifaceted development, this is what I mean. I mean the pieces in the puzzle that have to be negotiated and thought about. And you've got to understand where that athlete is. So now the next part of the puzzle, when you look at this slide, you should be thinking, what is in my athletes, my individual athletes, what's the depth of that puzzle? What's the depth of the jigsaw piece? So what I mean by that is if it's only a very thin piece, it means we've got perhaps not got much capacity or capability in that area. Whereas if you've got a very good, well-developed capabilities within that piece of the puzzle, let's say we've got a deep piece. And so you can use this sort of framework of thinking, a very practical, hopefully a practical way of thinking, to sort of think about where an individual swimmer is at, where a squad of swimmers are at in the pieces, and where perhaps you've got good progress development and where you haven't. And so I've introduced this as well to use as a multifaceted way of thinking about swimming coaching, but it can open up a conversation for you with your coaches about where you and your athletes about where you're thinking they're at and where they're not at, and perhaps where you might want to think where you're going to want to go and where you want to develop moving forward. Of course, development over time. What do I mean by that? That's the bit where we've got to think, if you were to prioritize and think about any of the components of the performance puzzle, what I mean here is trajectories over time. What kind of trajectory do we want? Of course, you want the optimal trajectory, but what trajectories do we actually see? What is, we get lots of athletes on different trajectory paths. For whatever reasons, there could be lots of reasons out of that multifaceted puzzle that would give you an indication for why an athlete is suddenly accelerating in a short space of time, or they might have a short space of time here and then start to plateau off, which is a typical trend, or why we might be flatlining. And then the worst case of all, we've got deterioration over time, which is not, of course, athlete development, that's regression. So all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these concepts, but perhaps not systematically or possibly having a way to think about them in a conversational way on paper. So I'm just presenting that as my general overview of what I think athlete development is about. I'm not saying it's perfect or anything like that. I'm just saying it's the way that I've come to understand it and the way to think about it over time. I'll just hold that there, Russ, and if anyone wants to, before we move on, that's my kind of background framework that I'm working from, and me and Shaun will chat from, but opening up for questions or implications on that.
Great, thanks for that, Stephen. Is there any thoughts, questions, discussion points anybody wants to throw in at this point? Now I know, Paul Robbins, you'll have about 10 already, so don't be shy, sir.
I was going to ask the relationship between the cognitive development and the physical development, because we as coaches, we tend to look at the physical side more than the cognitive development from very early ages right through to senior ages. And I just wonder whether you have any thoughts on the neuroscience side of it as well.
Yeah, depends exactly what we're talking about, right? So depending on what functioning or what aspect we are thinking about, a lot of these skills aren't readily learned systematically. So a lot of you guys will be certainly putting in training programs that will try and systematically develop aerobic capacity, anaerobic power, etc. But you won't be necessarily thinking that way, and neither is there a lot of literature and common practice out there about how you develop those other things, because there's a lot of individuality, there's a lot of variation in way people to respond to training programs in these areas. But there is ample evidence out there to say that either generalized psychological training or developing cognitive flexibility, adaptability, resiliency, certainly they are skills that can be systematically learned. They just have to be very carefully developed in very controlled environments, because the nature of the detrimental outcomes from those kind of training regimes, as you know, from let's say military training, 12 weeks of military training for some people can be very much, and how you handle that as a coach and a support staff around those kind of exposures is you have to be very careful, because you might get very adverse effect. What you're trying to do is develop a cognitive skill like resiliency, but you might find that you might undermine and make actually the person lose all their confidence and be very vulnerable. So it's a very, very tricky, slippery area when you're in there.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
That's not. Sorry, I was just going to say that's not to say that I haven't been involved in that. I have, and only recently, I actually did a two-week sort of psychological challenge camp with a local coach who was working with their developing athletes, and we set up a whole series of scenarios that made the training very difficult and challenging in a psychological way. But at the same time, there's a lot of careful consideration on how you handle that and how you implement that, because you want to make sure you get the positive effects from that as opposed to the negative.
I suppose the interesting thing with this is when it comes to the whole thing of what is coaching and our role within that, isn't it? Because that's the art of coaches, isn't it? Because there's so, like you said in there, Steve, there's so few ways to actually have a real clear view of each of those areas and how well developed they actually are. You know, because it's very easy to maybe look at somebody who can sprint quite fast, and so you assume that part of their development is quite advanced, when the truth of the matter is it might just be that they've got great skills and you know, the anaerobic capacity is not developed at all, or the other way around. It might be because they're very anaerobic but the skills aren't very good, or that type of thing. And also, like, the interesting thing, number 19 and number 20, even though it's highlighted for injury prevention, you know, we also know that, you know, stretching and flexibility plays a massive part of recovery, and also making sure that the technique that we're looking for is efficient. And it's interesting that, you know, I've started working with the triathletes in the last 2 or 3 months, and because they spend a real lot of time over in a hunched position on the tri bars on the bikes in training, you know, you can imagine the sort of difficulties I'm having in terms of, you know, really getting the scapula to work properly, you know, to be able to get good catches and that type of thing. So it's really interesting.
And that comes back for me to that definition, which is you might have done a year's worth of high intensity program, but that might all go to kaput if you've then got a serious injury that hasn't compensated for that situation that you've just described. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're trying to get development, but you've actually compromised longer term development.
Yeah.
And so this is, and it's very hard. I mean, there's coaches here, I'm sure, at different levels of skill and development, but senior coaches, I'm sure, will understand that there's an interconnectivity, and hence why I've got these pieces connecting up, that you have to be able to see the broader map. You have to be able to then dive down into one of those pieces and have knowledge and skill in that, which is hard. I mean, you take number 17 or any one of those components, you could have whole workshops and conferences just on one of those pieces, right?
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of specialism and expertise just in one piece. But that's the strength in when you go into that area that you have, and you need to call upon all other knowledge and expertise if there is that in one of those areas. But at the same time, you've got to also be able to, like you said, Russ, is be able to understand how is that going to then connect. If I do work in that area, is that going to connect with other pieces? Is that going to change other things that might reach over across other areas to help the more holistic aspect of the development? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And also, you know, the kind of understanding that very few of these areas are actually, you know, once you've done a certain amount of it, you can't just turn around and say, right, that's done now, so I don't need to worry about that anymore. I can move on to something else, you know, because obviously, you know, if you're really working on aerobic capacity, that's going to limit the anaerobic capacity development. And so as you progress from one, you know, part of the season to the next, it's being able to maintain the levels that you've developed as you move on to other, start prioritizing other areas, and knowing how much you need to do to be able to maintain what you've developed as you move into that other area.
Yeah, and that's a very important conversation, not to just have with yourself, which is you've got to be aware of your own knowledge and expertise and sort of say, well, okay, what should I be prioritizing for this athlete at this amount of time, at this stage of their development? What do I need to prioritize when? So then you do that. And then as you go through your training cycles, or whatever those may be, it's then when do I transition to prioritize something else that is going to either build off the back of that, but then all transfer to develop something else. Because obviously you can't build all 20 pieces at once. Exactly. That's another reason why hopefully it's giving you a frame in which to work. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So, absolutely. Is there any other observations, guys? Any other comments before Steve moves on?
Yeah, Russ, can I just dive in there quickly?
Yeah, hi, Kev.
I think one thing for me, especially like we've got a lot of experienced coaches on the call, is that there's a lot more awareness of this, but you get a lot of young coaches who are perhaps starting off and have got a book and perhaps their peripheral knowledge of these wide range of areas that they need to consider is not necessarily there. Obviously, mentoring is getting better and stuff like this is obviously really helping. But if we're out there supporting, young and developing coaches at the start, when they're first coming on deck, where would you prioritize based on all of these things that you're looking at now in terms of laying the foundations on their knowledge?
Is that a question for me, Kev?
Yeah, if that's all right.
Yeah, I actually, given my swimming background, I'll openly say that I don't know enough in swimming to give you a brilliant answer. But I would say that from what I've understood so far is that if you're certainly talking about younger athletes in starting off on their journey at the younger end, technical skill, competency, and awareness, positions in the water, skill is the message that I keep hearing about.
And how does that kind of, having been in like a number of sports, how does that translate to, a lot of sports talking about, laying the groundwork from a physiological point of view and all those sorts of things? Because you get a lot around when's the right time to do it, pre-puberty, post-puberty, all of those sorts of things. Like how have you kind of pulled that across from other sports and kind of observed in the swimming world, I guess, what we perceive to be the norm?
Yeah, well, we'll certainly go into can talk later a little bit more about when some of these things are important, but certainly kinesthetic awareness of body position and being able to understand from a younger age and know what positions your body is in is certainly massive in most sports. Like, so take football and being able to have an awareness of body angles, what positions they're in, how they connect with the ball, deliver force and impact into a ball, whether it's a short pass or a 50-yard pass. That's the focus of my coaching. I'm presently coaching, for example, and this is a good one, under sevens girls. My daughter's 6-7 years old. I'm coaching under sevens, and without them even being consciously aware of me doing it, I'm actually talking to them all the time about how to make contact with the ball and what body position they're in. Although I don't explain that to them, I just give lots of visual demos and strategies of how to do that. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. Now in swimming, Shaun, you might be able to drop in here from your experience, or Andrew, what would you say about skill contribution at the early stages?
Shaun, do you want to go ahead or?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'll start.
I'll jump in after.
Yeah, I've hit the ground running with all this from 2017, 2018, but I've been a swimmer all my life, and then coached a little bit through uni when I was trained as an exercise physiologist. And I think from what I was most aware of is probably coaches starting from the age group level. So once our learn to swim streams had sort of ended, you then, you've learned to swim and then you move into the competitive streams. And so at that time, I was very aware of who those sort of coaches were because they were all around my age. And basically what it was, you get given your whiteboard marker and you whiteboard, and then basically you're prescribing from experience. So very, very few coaches that I know have come from the other way where, they might have some prior education under their belt and then they've stepped into coaching. So, and you can tell who those sorts of coaches are by the way you do see them coach and the way they interact with their kids at competitions. So that was probably the most obvious thing to me. Otherwise, there's differences in the way a coach can relate and understand different personalities of their swimmers compared to the other skill of being able to program. So it depends on what coaches seem to perceive as their, what defines their philosophy of coaching. Some coaches I see are fantastic programmers and it's so structured, but, because of that planning, when you take individual characteristics like we'll eventually get to, all that stuff can eventually go out the window and they can't necessarily adapt to what's going on with that individual across the season. So essentially that season eventually goes in the bin. But yeah, I could go on about this all day. Andrew, what about you?
I think I've got a little bit of an advantage here because Kevin and I spoke recently and he asked me a similar question. He asked me what would I go back and say to myself sort of 10 years ago. And it came down to one of the answers I gave was straight away like a mentor relationship. So as a young coach, but also trying to get, I think, accepting the non-linearity of coaching as well as it is for the athlete as well. So explorative practice from the coach as much as from trying to give it to the athlete, which gives flexibility and not having that stress to tick too many boxes and actually learn your trade. And I think from that you can start to develop with the guidance of a good mentor. You can start to develop the principles around what you're doing and why you're doing it. If I'd had that, if I went back to when I first started coaching, that might be the foundation, which correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, if that's what you're asking, would be like, where would I start? Well, I think that'd be a good place to start out and support young coaches in experimenting with what they're doing and learning these components. Like there's 20 odd jigsaw puzzles, learning how they interact, because I believe that they all do interact with each other, whether you like it or not, because we can't pull people apart. So that'd be my take. Is that all right, Kevin?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate that.
Just one of the things I'd chip in at that point is it's interesting that if I think about, say, the top 10 athletes that I've coached, not just age group swimmers, but swimmers that have made senior teams. It's interesting that a real lot of them, I would say the majority, maybe with the exception of one, are ones that have come through the program and so have had a real emphasis of skill development at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years of age. So that then I was able to really start focusing on the aerobic development at 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and particularly for the female athletes, to be able to get them into some level of hard aerobic training before they start going through the stages of puberty. Not so important with the boys, because the boys tend to have a more steady growth period, and I found with my swimmers. And it's interesting that when I've had swimmers that have come to my program perhaps 15, 16, 17, or particularly 18 when they come to university, and I'm having to spend a real lot of time retrofitting skills and behaviors which normally would be addressed at a very young age if they'd come through my program. And so we're actually losing perhaps a year or two of what you would consider a natural progression at that age, at 18, 19, 20, because I'm having to go back and retrofit skills and retrofit behaviors and characteristics and resilience in particular. That's a real big thing. And quite often, I would say that for every 10 students that come to university that start in the program in September, often only 8 or 10 are left at Christmas because their ability to step it up at an older age is very, very difficult, and takes a long time and a lot of time that they're not prepared to give. But if I had an athlete that comes to me at 18 and says, look, I'll do whatever I need to do, genuinely I would say, right, you need to write off the next 2 years, because it's going to take that long to retrofit the skills that we need, to build the resilience, to have all the adaptations that you need to get into a position where you can start training like a world-class athlete should be at 18, 19, 20 as a mature adult. So I think that goes back to your question, Kev. In my experience with my most successful athletes, the majority of them came from a situation where the skills and the behaviors were learned at a young age, and then the teenage years was all about the capacities rather than having to retrofit those things.
Thank you.
Okay, that's good, Russ, because that aligns them with what I'm hearing, what I would have thought from another sport, and what I've heard from the Australian coaches.
Great. Any other questions, guys? Great. Right, let's move on.
All right. So what we'll do now is move into looking at the idea of individual developmental differences. So already in a lot of your discussion, you've talked about this, differences between sort of swimmers and where certain swimmers might be, and hopefully you can see the connection now with the bigger framework, that depending on who we're talking about and what developmental stage we're talking about, we've already got quite a lot of variability. So the next bit then I just want to get into is something that actually a lot of it you can't control. It's actually genetically driven, or it's something that's created by the system, which is this idea of relative age. So I'm going to just explain to you what I mean here by two key developmental differences which are important in junior development in swimming, as in other sports. And it's this idea of relative age, which I think most of you all know what relative age is. It's the idea of how old you are relative to your peers in your annual age group. So we can have people who are relatively older because their date falls perfectly on either an event cutoff or a year cutoff, either in the school year or in the calendar year that a lot of sports use. And so we get variation from normative aging processes. But then we also have the second factor, which is one that's been already mentioned, which is growth and maturation variation. So it's what time points you go through your growth spurts, and in particular, your re-accelerated growth spurt, known as puberty, as mentioned. And so it's the timing and tempo. So timing, at what chronological age point does that happen? Do you go through your re-accelerated growth spurt? And then tempo is the rate, the speed at which you go through. So there's two key components here, which I'm sort of highlighting because they are really impacting upon anthropometry and physical fitness indices. So here in the top right, we've got two swimmers from Shaun's data. And you can see, for example, these guys are quite different, but they're actually the same decimal age. They're in the same age group. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shaun. Are they the same decimal age, but they're different in terms of maturation status?
They're about 6 months apart, but they're in the same age group. Yeah.
All right. So they're 6 months apart in terms of relative age?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. 6 months apart in terms of relative age, but then in terms of their maturational status, you can see also that there is something quite anthropometrically different about the capacities possibly that guy on the right. And you can even in fact see that he is gone through a rapid growth spurt because he's got stretch marks also on his back. You might not be able to see that but you'll notice this in your swimmers as well if they're going through rapid growth spurts. So the difference here, within a year, you've got normative variation, which occurs reflected by height and weight differences, as well as bone development, etc. Multiple bodily functions that are varying. But then if a swimmer is going through an earlier time point of their growth spurts, it's also going to change the physical fitness indices as well. So we've also got strength, power, aerobic capabilities, aerobic capacities. So essentially you're dealing with, if someone who is relatively older and they are also an early maturing athlete, you're essentially dealing with a different specimen, possibly, compared to someone who is on the counter extreme, who is going to be relatively younger and they are later maturing. So you might, and typically in youth sport, they're not even there. They might have already disengaged because they're developmentally not getting a chance in many sports contexts to impart their influence, let's say, on performance, either in an individual or team setting. So what's the outcome of that? The outcome is these two trends, which you observe and you might have heard about in sport, which are relative age biases in participation and in selection, and maturity biases, which is the overrepresentation of the early maturing or advanced proportion of the population in annual age groups. And to illustrate that, here's some data from Australian swimming at each age group. So we've got national age participation data here from the national championships, juniors, 12 to 18 years old. And we've got essentially, I've combined data here across male and female swimmers in 4 strokes, 50, 400 meter freestyle, 102 meter, 200 meter breaststroke. And we've just compiled that data together. That's typically the some of the most popular events anyway. And I'm just showing you here the discrepancy or the odds of making a national age qualification time, depending on whether you're the relatively older compared to the relatively younger individual at what used to be 12 years old. And so here's the odds compared to almost 0 at 12. So if you're relatively younger, just relative age, if you're younger in that age group, what's the odds of making a national age qualification time? Pretty much 0. Then as you get to 13, the effect starts to dissipate a bit. By 15, 16, we're starting to see a leveling out, which is hopefully starting to bring to mind what might be happening. And by 17 and 18 in these 4 strokes, and this is a common trend that we started to see, and it's occurring earlier in female swimmers than males, we're starting to see a transition into the relatively younger swimmers being overrepresented. So there's something going on, there's dynamics at play. So when we go back to that framework, non-linear development, think about what's happening over time. There is dynamics at play, and this is illustrating here that it might be due to some things either to do with system structure and or genetically driven biological development, irrespective of what you guys might be doing as coaches, etc. So transition going on, changes, different people making the national age championships at different times. That data that we have just showed there is what got started the conversation with Swimming Australia, and Swimming Australia really wanted to look at what was going on here and what some of the implications of that data were. And so we've got those kind of data for each stroke, each year, each event, and then we've got it state level as well. So we've got masses of data to back that up, that those patterns are occurring. And that then led us into this idea of starting a project that looks into these inter-individual developmental differences. I've just come out the slides there. What the project H2Grow is about is essentially looking at what's going on with these inter-individual developmental differences. What is happening in terms of the changes over time? What can we do about it? And then what can we do to assist the coach community? And so we developed a whole series of resources, and we've done a lot of data collection, which we can show you some of that tonight in what is being involved in that. The size of the project has been huge, and Shaun has been instrumental in helping with this, but it's involved data extraction from multiple data sources. It's involved data collection at national, state and local events across Australia, over a three-year period. It's involved data collection with swimming clubs across Sydney. We're presently tracking thousands of kids who are turning up at state level events, and we're tracking over 300 kids longitudinally in Sydney and New South Wales. And we're looking at what is happening over time in multiple facets of their development. So let me just come back to screen now. And what I just want to hand over to Shaun to do is, just because there was, prior to this project, there was no data on the impact of growth and maturation. I'll hand over to Shaun to show you some initial data and patterns that have been coming out of that. Can you hear me, Shaun?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Russ. Thanks, Steve. Well, yeah, I've been on this for the last 2.5 years, and as an ex-swimmer, I thought my early mornings and my weekends at carnivals might have finished, but here we are, and it's really good because we've been around to state, as Steve might have mentioned, state, domestic, and district, regional events to get a look and get a bit of picture, a snapshot of what developmental stage the kids are at in our age group competitive pathways. And if you think about what Steve mentioned earlier, with relative age effects existing, because you've got kids within an age group, maturation doesn't adhere to chronological timeline in essence, or is bound by that 12-month age group that you set. So we can potentially have kids up to 3-4 years of biological difference set within one chronological age group. So and these are the sorts of things that we did find. But this slide that you're looking at here is an example of the 100-meter freestyle swimmers that we sampled. There are over 700 of them, aged between 12 and 17 years that were competing at these events, and they attended our Project H2 Grow measurement station to get measured and to begin being tracked with us as part of the ongoing longitudinal research that we intended to do. And so what you can see here is that what you've got is these are all the kids regardless of what age group they're in, but you've got their maturity timing, which we get an assessment of based off their age at peak height velocity. So if you've come across relative age effects before, I'm guessing you've also come across peak height velocity estimations. So by getting the swimmer's height, their weight, and their sitting height, we also collect the parents' heights. We can get a rough idea of how old these kids will be when they're at the time point where they're going to be growing their most. So during maturation is characterized by reacceleration in growth, and within that growth period is where a lot of the growth spurts are occurring before slowing down, but continuing up until they reach their full adult mature stature. So when we had a look at where our kids were in essence with maturity timing, is you can see here by the columns, by the distributions, that we found that we had an overrepresentation of normative to early maturing athletes, as well as early maturing athletes. So those were athletes that were entering peak maturational growth earlier than what we would expect them to do, or hypothetically expect them to do, compared to a normal population distribution. So you can see the black line there. That's actually what I guess you would expect the distribution to look like if you were to get the peak height velocity age measurements of kids in the school playground or somewhere in the general population. But in the sport, you can see that these distributions are skewed right up towards the earlier maturing time points. And what was most surprising was that we had no late maturers being assessed or being present in the sport in the competitions, and that was irrespective of which maturation estimates we used to predict with. We just didn't see any late maturers. So that gave us a fair understanding of the developmental timing of the athletes that were in the sport. So you can imagine, you know, how difficult in essence it would be for a later maturing athlete to compete in the sport based off the developmental advantages that Steve had pointed out that may be afforded to those early maturing boys. So we started off with some sample data as we were getting it in that we've been collecting on the fly, and this is just a snapshot of 300 swimmers across 9 to 18 years that we had collected, piloting this and when we were looking to get this up and running. And when we plotted the swimmers according to their age and with their respective 100-meter freestyle time, and we coded them according to their maturity timing category, either as early, normative, or late, we can see that there were distinct differences in the mean trajectories of each of these swimmers based off their timing. So with the red dots there, you can see the early maturers, and their trajectories show or describe that they're quite prominent on the scene in early adolescence. They're coming in quite sharp, around about that 11, 12, 13-year-old mark. But then by 15, you start to see their rate of decrease, or their rate of improvement is starting to level off a lot more sharply. If you have a look at the green line there, these are our late maturers, but as you might have remembered, I said that we didn't have any late maturers. What we did was we redistributed the sample that we had to say, okay, well, if we don't have any late maturers as per the general population, then who is a later maturing athlete within the sport? And so when we looked at the trajectory of those athletes, we can see that their improvement rates are a lot more steady. You can see them they're still behind, they're not really noticed at that early adolescent stage, in 13, 14, 15, you can see that difference between the green and the red lines quite substantially between 13 and 15, which is where we know peak height velocity and peak maturational related growth is occurring. But then because they continue to gradually improve, by the time you're 17 or 18, when those maturational differences have all finished and all cesated, that you're left with two comparable athletes based on their performance time. So obviously there's some, thanks, Steve. So right. if you, you just move me along. So if you can understand that and you want to accept that, then you can see where this quote might have some relevance for discussion. So this was taken. This quote was taken from a book or book review. I've forgotten now, but Alec Whalen was within the coaching team of Michael Phelps in his early stages. I think Alec was a part-time coach, or maybe gone to full-time, but a lifeguard as well. And he was always there around watching Michael Phelps as he trained. And he made the comment that there's nothing like the growth spurt or the pituitary gland to make a coach look good. And so you can see that that's when we have to start to think about what is going into these swimmers' performances during this time, when we know that maturation may be a key underlying factor that may be explaining the development that we're seeing.
Just to add on from that, one thing that when we were showing some of this data to a lot of the coaches over here, Jaco Verheeren, who I'm sure all of you know, would always stick his hand up a couple of times in these coaching sessions and would say, Steve, you're telling me that by me doing nothing and just standing on the side, I should expect my swimmer to get better. And I said, yes, theoretically so, because as they grow normatively, they will, those anthropometrical changes and physiological changes will impart their influences on performance. But he was also, in saying that, he was also trying to make a statement about the fact of what is the contribution that you as a coach should be making and where you should be making for an athlete at that time. So he was asking a more subtle question and making a more subtle statement about, where are your impacts? There will of course be impacts on skill and lots of other things, but you have to think about what is it that's actually contributing to the performance right now. Is it actually the coach, or is it actually something else at that developmental time? And do you know what kind of athlete you've got in front of you? Obviously, what we found in our sport is that we're definitely tending to prefer and pick those early maturing kids, boys in particular, because they're making the performance times. But does that equate to longer term development? No, it doesn't. And we're seeing the transitions down the line. So it's really hopefully raising a lot of issues about what you're doing and what you're disclosing early that might actually come good later. So yeah, we'll pause there and open that up, Russ, if you want to, for any questions or ideas, but it also hopefully helps to make you think, well, what is the impact of these two developmental issues on broader things as well?
No, that's fantastic. That's great, guys. Kevin, you made a comment in the chat box.
Yeah, really, like to everyone there, just obviously if your data's measuring based on performance competitions, whether they're, you know, county, regional, national level, if the bulk of certainly the pre-youth or pre-pubescent participants are based on or made up of early developers and early maturers, then do you think that kind of skews the data a little bit, in the sense of the fact is, in the total pool of swimmers, excuse the pun, actually there probably are some amazing late maturers, but they're just hiding in the wings. Like the example I give quite a lot of parent talks is, I'm like, on our current talent program in England, the 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds weren't picking up swimmers like Adam Peaty because they weren't ranked high enough, but he's come through later and actually does our sport because of that, put off those swimmers. And I actually say kids like him, we actually have in spite of the system, not because of it. So really just getting the thought on what that data is going to lead to next. Is there going to be a change, do you think, in the system and the way we rank, in inverted commas, young athletes and prioritize who are the ones that are going to go on and do well?
So Kev, what you said there, in spite of the system, is exactly the language that is being used here. Because of the emphasis on stopwatch and that blooming timer up there, and what goes beyond, what goes into making that performance. Again, back to the multifaceted elements. And the problem is, what we're saying here is that one big element is these developmental issues early on confound and make it cloudy and confuse what is making a good swimmer. And actually it's growth and development, and not the things that you actually really want to be interested in, which is skill and all the other things, right? And so you're right in that we also are seeing massive discouragement, I would say, because we didn't see in our data any of those late developers. They're in the club, they might be in the club system, but they're likely being put off because the competition and the emphasis on competition, doing well at competitions, suggests that that is what means you're good and you're competent. And if you're not making that grade, then you're being discouraged. And whether they are there at club level and they hang around at club level, well, there's got to be some other ways that they're being kept in. Otherwise, I think you've got essentially a lot of dropout and withdrawal because of that they're behind the 8 ball from the start.
Brilliant, thanks.
And I'll into the latter part of your question, Kev, I will show you, I'll explain some of the ideas we've got about how we're trying to address it. Is that okay, Russ?
Yeah, spot on. Is there any other questions there? Any other comments, guys?
Could I have one, Russ?
Oh, go ahead.
I'm just wondering whether there's been any research on the impact of older girls losing to very younger swimmers. It must be, quite psychologically damaging that a 16-year-old girl that trains regularly is then suddenly beaten by a 13 or even a 12-year-old girl. And I wonder whether there's been any research on the psychological impacts on the older swimmers when they're going through a very difficult time.
Yeah, okay. So good point, Paul, because we also, and Shaun, I'm sure you'll reinforce this, we certainly observe the tendency for very different effects of growth and maturation on the female swimmer compared to males. So for males, it's straightforward: broader shoulders, grow, get a lot of arm propelling benefits, fantastic, everything's in a straight line, brilliant. But for girls, growth and development doesn't mean that the changes in body shape are all, we think, are all contributory to performance development, as you know. So an early maturing girl who will have benefits somewhat from increased capacities physiologically will get benefits at, let's say, 12 and 13, up to 12, 13, 14, bearing in mind where they go through that development. But then afterward, the counter effects of continued growth and development might work in reverse. And so this explains, from a biological growth and anthropometry change point of view, why someone at 15, a girl at 15 and 16 might struggle compared to a girl at 13, 14, first of all. And then the second part of the question is there been any studies on it from a psychological point of view? I'm not aware of them. I think anecdotally, we can certainly understand why a lot of girls are highly invested up until that point and struggle with the fact that then they feel like they're going backwards, because we also see in our trend lines that a lot of girls actually do plateau out and then start to reverse, to go backwards in terms of performance.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, if you happy, Russ? Because I'll carry on.
Yeah, no, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, so next point, I'm going to hand back to Shaun to tell you about then how we've been looking at tracking some of the longitudinally, some of these development issues and how they relate to some coaching technical assessments.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So you know, if we know that the maturation status is related to those physical capacities that make a swimmer a better swimmer in terms of height, lean body mass. You know, we know that maturation is associated with cardiovascular endurance development, muscular strength and speed, and these all interact together to help to assist improve performance. And you know, when you look at swimming specifically, you start to see things like upper body strength being strongly related with stroke length and propulsion. So, you know, the slide that was previously shown with all the, and as Steve mentioned, with all the pieces of the puzzle, you know, if we know that maturation is influencing performance and selection overall in swimming, you know, the next question is to then break it down and say, okay, well, what facets of the performance are more or less influenced by maturation? Because we know two different swimmers are going to get to the same line using different strategies. In essence, there's strengths and weaknesses amongst all swimmers. So the big thing was, and from an application point of view, because that's definitely my interest, is okay, well, what about technique? What about skill? Because the essence of learning to swim is first of all that, learning to swim, developing your stroke, and then it's all about working on how to get faster. So from a coaching practice and technical skill point of view, understanding how to or looking at what we can do to assess skill and assess movement efficiency is certainly important, and it was certainly a question as to whether maturation influenced those facets. And so what we wanted to do in order to have a look at that is I tracked a large group of athletes. In this case, I think I end up mentioning that it's 64 freestyle swimmers, but collectively it's been 300 over the last few years. But there's so much data to get through. I'm getting to it as I can. And what happened was I tracked these boys over two summer seasons, and I visited them on up to 5 occasions, and it was each spaced 4 months apart. And each time I visited them, we did an anthropometric assessment, and that allowed me to estimate their maturity status. And we also did a 200 freestyle time trial. And so in terms of field-based tests and tests that I could do there at the club pool, obviously we were looking at the time that they did for that 200 freestyle, but also I was more interested in having a look at what other indices we could use that better describe skill and aren't so closely related necessarily to just how fast they were swimming. And so to do that, I had a look at their mid-pool swim velocity and looking at that and their stroke frequency, as well as some of their anthropometric measures. That allowed me to calculate what's called their stroke index and their arm propelling efficiency. And just in case, I'm not sure if the next slide has it, but stroke index, no, yeah. Yeah, sorry, thanks, Steve, stay there. In case you've read about stroke index before, but aren't overly familiar with it, it's essentially how quickly someone can cover a given distance in one stroke cycle. And so that's a very, that trickles down to very common drills that we do within a training environment, but it's also an indicator in the literature of swimming efficiency. The other one, arm propelling efficiency, sorry, Steve, it can be described as the fraction of total mechanical power which is exerted by a swimmer that is converted into useful propulsive power. So essentially the total amount that they're producing and what amount of that is converted into useful propulsive power from the arms. So I think we can move on now. So have a look at this. It was the first thing we did was to say, okay, well, we haven't really quantified how maturation predicts mid-pool freestyle velocity before. So it'd be good to have a look at what that actually looks like. And when we had a look at it, we can see that across maturation with these kids that each had five repeated measurements, that maturation strongly did predict freestyle velocity, but it was in a curvy linear trend. So maturation continues to predict freestyle velocity, in a large effect right up until peak height velocity when they're growing their most, and then it starts to peter out around 2-3 years post maturation. So, and because maturation explains a lot of the variance in swim velocity, we know based off the discussions that we've been having that it's clearly may not be an accurate indicator of skill assessment in youth swimmers, but no one had really looked at this before explicitly. It's been done before using sexual maturation characteristics used as a covariate, and chronological age has been used before, but maturation status hasn't been used, which accounts for the developmental growth differences of the kids. I think we can move on. Thanks, Steve. So now it gets really interesting. Is that when we had a look at the swimmer's stroke index, and as you might recall that it's how quickly a swimmer can travel a certain distance within one stroke cycle, we can see that ability, or as stroke index goes up, so too does freestyle swim velocity. It's almost linear. It goes up, almost unit per unit. So we can see there that if a swimmer does have a higher stroke index, they're also going to be faster. But I guess the problem or the challenge there is if you are viewing a swimmer's stroke index, then we need to be aware that the maturation also explains the stroke index values that we see. And we can see that continues to occur, although you can see that on the right here, that graph where you've got maturation at the bottom, stroke index on the left, on the y-axis there, you can see that the black trend line continues to go up, and really doesn't start to decline until 2.5-3 years post peak height velocity. So it's quite a present effect all the way up until full adult maturity is reached. So again, when this could have potential implications for when we're looking at our swimmers, even in a training session and things like that we have to be aware that over time, as maturation is occurring, it's also funneling that improvement in stroke index. So I think that's all I wanted to say on that. Yeah, Steve, if you can just go to the next one. Yeah. So what we next had a look at then was our arm propelling efficiency. And this is where it gets interesting again. So we've got two, we had stroke index and now we've got arm propelling efficiency, two common indices of looking at stroke efficiency and technical skill. And what we can see here again is that as your arm propelling efficiency increases, so does your speed. So that's a positive thing. But at this time, on the right, what you can see is that there's a lot of individual variance in the dots there. You can see they're all spread out, and what we found, there was no clear trend between maturation and arm propelling efficiency. So what that indicates to us is that there are other potential non-maturational related factors that are explaining that. You guys might be able to suggest, what those sorts of things are. But, if we're driving and looking at technical skill, then it's coming down to the things that potentially that you guys as coaches and other things that the kids may be doing at training, or anything that's really unrelated to the fact that they're just growing and developing, are starting to explain. And so because arm propelling efficiency wasn't influenced by maturation status, arm propelling efficiency may be an accurate indicator of skill assessment in these young swimmers. So if you, Steve, I think you can go down to the next one. But what was interesting to note is that essentially, what this all shows is that we have a lot of between individual differences, between the kids. So regardless of what we're looking at, the kids are showing that they're actually on similar individual trajectories. You saw that the individual, the series of dot points were actually lining up. They weren't zigzagging around. And so the expected changes in each of the individuals is occurring across maturation is relatively similar. But what this does highlight is that differences in these youth male swimming performance, and in the cases of stroke index at any one point in time, i.e. for a similar decimal age of say 2 athletes, this is potentially explained by high variability in maturity status. And so what's important to take away from this is that at any single observation time point, as in, like I said, 2 given swimmers of similar swim velocity, for example, may have different maturity statuses and different technical skill levels. So since both have been shown, and since both of these 2 factors, maturation and stroke index, have been shown to contribute to overall swim velocity and performance, coming back, looking at this summary diagram here, we've illustrated how crucial it is to understand that each swimmer will likely have different improvement trajectories, and potentially due to their maturation status. So you can see here in this graph is what we've tried to do is compile the 3 factors that we looked at and to look at their relative contributions to freestyle performance. So you can see that together maturation status, stroke index, and arm propelling efficiency collectively explain 86% of swim performance in this 200 time trial. But the tricky thing is that they are all in some ways related, most of them, so particularly maturation, is related to these other variables in its own way. So maturation status being related to stroke index is going to also then influence front crawl swimming, or freestyle swimming. In the case of maturation status and its influence on how arm propelling efficiency can determine freestyle performance, we see that when we had a look and looked at the combined effect of maturation and arm propelling efficiency, that, as you might expect, it paid for individuals to be both more mature and have higher arm propelling efficiency then had higher swimming velocities. However, arm propelling efficiency on its own isn't influenced by maturation status. So these things are all pulling and pushing each other in order to determine how fast your swimmer is going to swim.
That's a little bit more, technical, that one, but thanks for that, Shaun, because there's a lot in there, but it might be worth just pausing for some thoughts and any clarifications.
Any comments, any thoughts, guys?
Yeah, Shaun, For just for layman's terms, for these arm propelling efficiency, would that be that is literally the speed of the hands going over for a stroke cycle coming over the water? Is that correct?
It's an estimation equation of essential. I like to think of it as propulsion. So a swimmer is going to put in X amount of energy and movement into their stroke, but only a certain percentage of that energy and movement that goes into the stroke is going to propel them forward. So depending on how a swimmer aligns themselves, and how, in terms of how they catch the water, how they pull through the water, although this is looking relatively, mainly at the propulsive phase of the stroke, that's going to determine how much of the energy that they've spent to put into the stroke is actually going to be carried into pushing themselves forward and through the water. So it's an efficiency in the sense of being able to propel the body through the water, rather than an efficiency in the sense of that we might think of reducing resistance of the water on the body, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's great. Do you have what would be like an on-deck tool or way of looking at that and analysing that?
Well, arm propelling efficiency can definitely be calculated. The three things you need is you need to know what time they did and over what distance, so you can get their velocity. We tried to keep it as controlled for as possible by looking at mid-pool velocity, but just out in the field, as long as you can get their speed. Their stroke frequency, we're always taking stroke rates, and stroke rates is just a conversion. You convert stroke rate into a frequency value. And then you also need to know their shoulder to hand distance. So that's measuring from the point of the shoulder down to the tip of the hand when their arm is assumed in an outstretched position, similar to when they're catching and pulling through the water. If that's too complicated, then I'm still there's still definitely consideration of stroke index, because it's not just a time, or it's just not a speed, a velocity estimate of how the swimmers are travelling. Stroke index accounts for stroke length for a given velocity. And within stroke length, you need to know their stroke frequency again. And so stroke rate, so what that comes down to is stroke rate is a valuable tool for coaches, as you guys know. But I think having swimmers aware of what their stroke rates are and knowing what the stroke rate benchmark should be, because one of the graphs that wasn't shown here that we couldn't fit into the paper was that stroke rate didn't change across maturation. It stayed stable across that whole developmental period. So if there's another thing that's a quick fix in order to get some other feedback back that isn't going to change based off the swimmer's developmental stage, then stroke rate is a good place to start. Being mindful of stroke index and how that can change based off the swimmer's maturation is being aware of actually, I don't want to go into the implications. I want you guys to tell me. But yeah, there's a lot to take away from this. And arm propelling efficiency, in my eyes, is just another way to partition out that influence of maturation. So regardless of what the value indicates, our sample, I think on average, it was about a 25% conversion rate for their arm propelling efficiency, and that falls right plop in the middle of other studies that have looked at arm propelling efficiency. So it is interesting to see in how arm propelling efficiency is reported differently in other papers, but we were the first to look at it in terms of how that may or may not, in our case, didn't change according to our group's maturation status.
Cool, thanks. Would sorry, Shaun. Would one thing be to do, like if you used a common Wolf or the swimming golf kind of set, which would give you an idea of the stroke index. So you did a number of stroke counts to time in seconds, But I know maturation will play a part. So you might have a kid who can go faster and use less strokes. You could get two kids, for example, get their efficiency scores over like a 6-week period and see the change. Would that give you an idea of the efficiency that we're looking for as well, that isn't necessarily related to their maturation, because they're both improving in their own individual space? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think I found it most interesting looking at these values because I could see how they played a part even in my day-to-day training. And so essentially stroke index becomes very relevant once maturation is finished, because you know it's no longer going to play an effect. But when you're looking at the younger athletes, you're right, it is very important to see how you're using stroke index like as a benchmark, where if you're assessing stroke index, sorry, I got a cold at the moment. If you're assessing stroke index and that's, you know, spaced every 6 weeks, then sorry, I can't go. Can I just get some water?
That's all right. I'll carry on. I think one of the things that you're saying there, Andrew, is that if you've got 2 athletes and one of them, but you see a performance improvement in one, you want to be careful on what basis that improvement has come from. So if the efficiency is not changed, but growth and development has in one, for example, then you're going to see that's coming from growth and development. Efficiency hasn't changed. However, if the performance has got quicker and the efficiency is correspondingly changed, then it's likely that that efficiency is what's contributed towards the performance. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. And so it's useful to understand. It's a tool for you to understand what is explaining the change, because as we mentioned earlier, a lot of people don't know where that change is coming from. It likely for a lot of junior swimmers could be coming from surges in growth and development. For girls 14, 15 plus, it actually might be working against them, and a lot of coaches might not know why that is. Why are they treading water, and what do we have to do next to circumvent some of those developmental problems that might be working against progression? Okay, so if okay with you folks, I'll move forward. Is that okay, Russ?
Yeah, look, yeah, this is good.
All right, so we had a deep dive into some specific stuff there. What I want to return to now then is this idea that inter-individual differences creates problems. Shaun spoke about it then. A few of you have commented on, okay, what do we do about it? So one of the solutions that we've been working on over the last 3-4 years is this idea called corrective adjustment procedures. So it relies on getting lots of data on swimming performances and using that data to then make some adjustments given what we know about any 2 swimmers, let's say relative age differences to start with, or maturational differences. So here's some data on screen that we're just showing you longitudinal swimmers in 100-meter freestyle who over the period of being 10 to 19 years old have given us 5 data points, at least 5 data points. And we plotted a longitudinal trend line of their progression from 10, 11 through till 19 years old. And that's useful because we can use that trend line to then factor in what expected performance differences exist either within 1 year, across multiple years, but importantly for the sake of relative age differences within 1 year. First of all, when looking at this, can you notice on the graph that there is a tendency for more swimmers to be banked up against the right-hand side of each age group? So let's say 13 to 14 years old. Can you see that there's more swimmers banked up against the right-hand side towards being older?
Yeah.
Same here. That's the relative age effect. That is, there is more swimmers in these events, turning up at these events who are relatively older. So that's the overrepresentation of the relatively older that then equalizes out, comes 17, 18 years old later on. Still though, we can get the trend line of progression. Then what we can do is, let's assume that we're looking at 2 swimmers who sit within the 14 to 15 year. They're under 15. So 14, we've got someone who is, let's say, 14.1, and we've got someone who is expected to swim quicker, given the trend line. They're 14.9. We can use this trend line to adjust this swimmer's performance, the one that's behind the 8 ball a little bit. So they're younger, they're expected to swim slower based on the trend line, but we can quantify the difference and use this difference to change this performer's performance time. So it means we then adjust their performance time to estimate what they would be if they were the equivalent decimal age. And we can do that with any 2 swimmers at any relative age difference. Likewise, we can use the same principle if we looked at maturity. So maturity status, 100-meter freestyle swimmers. Here's a sample of a 700 freestyle swimmers according to maturity status. 0 is the point of peak height growth. So anything minus in the minuses means they're coming into their peak growth spurt. Anything at 0 is their peak growth point. And anything moving to the right beyond that means that they've gone past their peak growth spurt. These swimmers in this sample were 12 to 17 years old, and we can now look at any 2 swimmers who are in the same age group, but we know that biologically they may differ by 3 to 4 years, because that's the size of the variance of any 2 swimmers at that age. Let's say if when they're 14, they could be biologically different by almost 4 chronological years and more, possibly in particular cases. But here's 2 cases that Shaun's just highlighted. This person's an early maturer and they swam, okay, below the mean regression time. But here's a normative maturer, because we didn't have any late maturers, as remember, they're not here. So this is a normative maturer, but is back here relative to this really early maturer. We can use the trend line again to show or imagine, what if these 2 swimmers were actually the same maturity age point, or maturity status, should I say? If we could adjust this performance using the normative trend line, where would that swimmer actually be? We can do that. Now, expectedly, this swimmer who's behind the 8 ball is going to swim on average a lot slower, but the trend line shows us that, than the swimmer who is up here. All right. But when you factor this in, you can see the size of the change can be quite big. And so we use that idea to then develop what we call corrective adjustment procedures. So this is a piece of software that we've developed that uses information from swimming events in Australia in juniors, either at specific ages, specific events, specific strokes, specific distances. And it uses those trend lines to then adjust individuals in that meet. So here's, I can't show you the names, but essentially you've got on here the performance times in a 100-meter butterfly. And this was a true event, looking at 15-year-olds. So we've got their swim times here, we've got their rank, and then we've made, using that procedure that I've explained on the previous slides, we've then got their adjusted times based on the changing up to the person who is the oldest or most mature in the race. That's the reference. And then we've calculated their adjusted times, the time difference, and the amount of change. And in this particular example, I won't go into detail, the person who did finish first still finished first. They were accounting for those developmental advantages that they had. This was a relative age example. They still finished first, but there was a swimmer who did finish 11th down here, who because they were relatively younger in the race and quite younger by some distance, they actually got a lot of adjustment benefit, and it made their rank change go from 11 plus 9 places, and they actually were ranked second after that adjustment. So we've applied that, We've trialed it, we've tested it, and we've started to see some nice results from it. And the kind of results we're starting to get is these kind of things, where here's an example of data from 13-year-old 100-meter freestyle swimmers at state and national events. In terms of their relative age, here's the normative distribution of everyone at state and national level. So we've got a relative age bias, as we've seen at 13. And with when we look at who makes the top 50, 25, and 10% of raw swim times, who is likely to make those categories? A bit like making a heat or a final, right? So the odds increase up. Every time you put in a bar or a benchmark criteria for who's going to make the highest level performance times, the importance of relative age goes up, and the chances are that for the top 10%, you've got to be relatively older. So that's the typical bias that we've seen. What I'm now going to show you on the right-hand side of this graph is look what happens to the distributions after we've used that piece of software to correct for those relative age differences. Now we are removing, so this distribution here is, there's no significant difference in the distribution, whereas originally it looked like that. And so we are now correcting the bias towards the relatively older. Here, top 25% of swims, that was the original distribution of all swimmers. Now it looks like that. And now we've got here the top 10% of swims after adjustment, it looks like that. So, and that's non-significant as well. So what it's starting to show you is that we're removing that bias, we're correcting for it. And we're starting to see, hopefully after the correction, who might be a swimmer who is swimming a slightly better time, irrespective of developmental differences. Does that make sense?
Steve,
Andrew, do you want to yeah, go on, Kev.
I was just going to say, can that be applied to individuals? Because obviously there's a lot of averages and distributions here. So could you take that model, create, you know, here you go, here's a great business idea for somebody, you know, and actually have a piece of software where you could plug in their time, their core measurements to actually say, look, this is where they are relative to their biological growth versus their chronological growth, and then it adjusts their time. So actually you can see their individual trajectory and actually say, wow, this 12-year-old that's looking actually average is unbelievable potentially. And vice versa, somebody that is doing unbelievably, but then you actually plug in the system and go, yeah, actually it's just a 6'5", 12-year-old, so let's not get excited.
Kev, you're on it. You're on it. You've got the idea. Yeah. So we can put that information in at an individual level, and we can look at trajectories relative to a broader level and see where they're at given their developmental differences. Yeah.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah. I see your hand up, Andrew. I got your hand up there. So you okay?
Yeah, Stephen, thanks a lot. Yeah, really, really interesting. I suppose my question is, what do you do with the information? Is it for education? Is it for understanding? Is it for selection? Or are the meet results amended? Or is there two streams? Is there a outcome result and then a adjusted result? Or how does that work?
Yeah, we can provide both. So we can provide obviously the adjusted time, and we can calculate those for either two swimmers or all swimmers in a given event or a given year. We can do that. What you do with it is the bit that we actually think we need your input on. So what do you think you could do with it? Do you think it's useful? And then if yes, what do you think it would be useful for?
I think it's incredibly useful in terms, particularly around education with parents and athletes. I suppose I wasn't sure whether Swimming Australia had done anything around giving medals, awards to those swimmers who were adjusted, or whether it was still based on outcomes at this stage. Well, was there any intentions of doing that, or are you nearly creating two sets of results, one as the race finishes, and then one set of results that shows the potential of the swimmers who maybe finish further down the ranks, I suppose, is where I was thinking.
Well, we have that capability for sure, and we can do that. So we can present both. And so the answer to that is yeah. A lot of the things that you mentioned there, Andrew, is the kind of things that were also said by are being said and have been said by the Australian coaches as well. And so I'm just putting on here some bubbles for what we think could be useful, but I'm certainly not tied down to any of them. If that helps.
Yeah, no, it does. I was always interested in some of the work that did in Premiership clubs, and I can't quite remember the name of it, but it was using a method of predicting biological age and creating a competition format where
I'm familiar with that.
You know what I'm talking about, don't you?
Yeah, it's called biobanding. So that's
the one, biobanding, yes.
So biobanding is being one strategy that's been certainly promoted quite a bit in around UK and in a few sports, but mainly soccer. Yeah. But it's certainly been talked about a lot over here. And but it's one strategy, right? It's one strategy amongst many. And the reason why we probably went down this route is because we wanted something to fit for swimming. So swimming, and it's the nature and the demands of swimming, you know, when we're realistic in saying we're not going to change the system, we're not going to change the importance of essentially an individual swim time. So we've got to work with that and then show and prove how what we can provide can add information or add something different, start the conversation that way, and then it will lead to some changes, which it is doing for sure.
Yeah, no, brilliant, Stephen. Thanks a lot.
That's right. Andrew, I'll just switch to you because I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's interesting to follow Andrew Reid there because Swim Ireland, or at least Swim Ulster, have done a few things in this direction, you know, with the emphasis on skills meets for younger swimmers, you know, ensuring that skill development is happening in swimmers who are going to go through to particular levels of galas and so on. I came slightly late to the webinar. I'm just wondering what data do you actually need in order to measure, you know, the relative maturity index? Is it just height and height changes over time, or I mean, is this data which is sort of readily collectible by you know, clubs with regard to each of their individual swimmers?
Yeah, what it means you do need a lot of data to be able to do this. That is the major challenge. And as you can see from the data I've shown, we've been fortunate enough to get a lot of data nationally, but also a lot of, and if you're interested in then collecting maturity status estimates, you do need methods to do that. There are a couple of methods out there, but typically we're using just general somatic, what we call somatic measure estimates, where you take basic indices of height, weight, leg length, and or in other methods, you might take parent height as well to estimate adult height. So there's a few little variations and nuances in each method, but those are the basic rubric components that you do need. And then you use a particular equation that matches those aspects to then estimate exactly where someone is in terms of their maturational status. They're not perfect measures by any means, but they're certainly the ones that we've got and that are used in the research, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. You then have to keep the data coming over time. And that actually then feeds back, the lack of perfection feeds back into the question that Andrew was raising about how you would use these two different rankings you then produce.
Yeah.
You know, you can't base everything on the adjusted ranking because actually it's slightly imperfect, you know, but it does allow you to share the joy of things around a little bit.
That's right. So I'm not going to sit here and I'm certainly not claiming that it's perfect, but what I can tell you is that, let's say, imagine that we did do estimates on the basis of relative age or maturity, and we used the trend lines to correct for them. What we would, let's say, do is we could then say, okay, let's imagine Jane was measured 9 months ago. We then did Jane's corrected adjustment. We can then see 9 months later, how far were we away based on a normative trajectory. And that would tell us how accurate our estimates would be. And actually, we're not far off. Of course, some swimmers regress, some swimmers go forward. That's why we're using the normal trend, right? We're assuming that most swimmers will go through the normative trend. But hopefully, as we've talked about right at the beginning, we would like to see coaches be able to intervene and optimize that developmental trend so that they don't do that. But what we're doing here is we're just controlling for that progressive influence, but we can't control for everything. True. Is that okay?
That's brilliant, brilliant. Paul Dower, you've got your hand up.
Hi, thanks, Russ. I'm interested to know. Obviously, in New Zealand Rugby looked at like categorizing younger kids with their weight, and you know, it's very interesting to see if you see some of the New Zealand Maori kids are pretty big, you know, up against some of the other kids, early matures, and I just wondered, like, it's all the dodgy Northern Irish accents going on here. Is that there a difference in ethnicity, or was that just not really considered with some of this study as well?
Yeah, that's one of the weaknesses of the measurement devices. They're based on Caucasian population estimates, so they're not necessarily so specific and relevant or applicable to other populations. So, for example, you're right, weight categorization has been one strategy applied over here because of those early maturing trends and earlier height and weight gain trends in some of the islanders. For example, the islander populations grow and are hugely developed by 15, 16 years old. But weight categorization for swimming might not be a relevant or as good a strategy to apply because it doesn't fit with the sporting demands necessarily. Do you know what I mean? So that idea we don't think would necessarily have as much best fit and relevance compared to the one that we've presented. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'd less interest about the weight and just I'm more interested about the ethnicity element, because I know in New Zealand I only had the kids, some of the island kids, to look at the gym equipment, and suddenly they put on muscle. And here in Singapore, you know, we have a very different population, very cross-cultural. So
that's right.
it's interesting.
Yeah, Shaun, do you want to add anything on that from your point of view?
Not particularly. There are studies that have been coming out looking at longitudinal growth in different ethnic backgrounds, but none necessarily that I've seen to tie back into how that could adjust the predictions that we give for each kid's maturity timing. I wouldn't want to go down that rabbit hole right now, because it starts to get very tricky depending on what sort of backgrounds you're talking about, and also what sort of environments that some individuals can be subjected to at early ages and things like that, because we know there are all sorts of things can start to influence a child's maturation.
Yeah, one thing that the data is just not there, Paul, to support the use of separate equations for different populations beyond Caucasian, right? But if you're taking Asian subsamples, for example, if we could, we would apply that equation that would be fitting to that population. Unfortunately, right now, that data isn't available to do that.
Sure, thanks, Steve. And sorry, just I guess one last question is that if you were the margin of error, I guess, if you applied your Caucasian to a Northern Irish side of swimming, I guess, is there some allowance that you would allow for that in your program, or just no data?
Well, one thing that we can draw some confidence from is the fact of how accurate are these trend lines. And so with these estimates in particular, because we've got longitudinal here, we know that the 95% confidence interval, so the margin of error of our estimate around this line if you can see my graph and screen here, the tightness of the confidence interval around here is very small. And correct me if I'm wrong, Shaun, it was something like 0.4 seconds for this.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, when we graphed it, you can't really, like, it's not included in this graph, but when we do produce the graphs in R or somewhere that fits the confidence intervals, you can't see it with regard to the thickness of the mean trend line. So it is very tight. I just forget what value it is.
So you could say, Paul, that 0.4 seconds, that's excellent, that's a great start, right? But depends what kind of level of swimming we're talking about. So if it's junior level swimming, which it's fit for, then yeah, between, let's say, 11, 12 years of age and 16, 17, that might be fine. But 0.4 seconds at higher performance levels, well, one, it's not going to be used at those higher performance levels at later ages, and also 0.4 seconds, that margin of error might not be acceptable. Yep, cool. Andrew?
I see. I was just thinking how, like, listening to this, and I've listened to similar you've done before, and I've always wondered, it looks after, and even one of the questions that popped up in the chat, it's good for potentially the mid and late maturers. What advice have you got, and practical kind of applications we can use to look after the early maturers to stop that level of burnout? Is that where the performance focus comes in? How we look after that, how we keep it competitive but move that kind of early pressure? And just a second part to that, would a quick way to get this kind of averaging effect would be that pre a certain age we used relay formats? And I know we've spoken about this before when you visited, relay formats that kind of average out the speed of performance. So you might have one really fast kid in there, but you might also have three who are not as fast. So it kind of averages things out. Would that be like a quick practical way to do it?
I think the second part of the question is a very hard one to address, because you've got inter-team dynamics going on, and you've got different capabilities or different swimming times, etc. So that's a hard thing right now to consider. And I wouldn't necessarily right now, we haven't got the data, for example, or the consideration to take this into relays, for example. So we keep that separate. But it has the potential, but it introduces lots of complexity because of it combined individuals' influences on performance. However, if we kept it individual, looking at the individual contribution to the total, that could be something that's doable. Back to the first point in your question, Andrew, is around, could this be, what does this mean for the early maturing swimmer? This is a good point, because this, and we have had this raised by other coaches, which is, does this mean that we're saying that the early maturing swimmers are rubbish? No, not at all. What we are saying here is that depending on what kind of developmental stage your swimmer is at in terms of maturity status, you should be thinking about what do they need on their developmental journey next. So if you've got an early developmental swimmer that's coming in at an earlier age, making those performance times and qualification times early, they're on that fast trajectory, but you should know straight away by 15, 16 years of age, that early maturing swimmer is likely finished in terms of their growth and development. So their onward development has to be coming from different facets of their jigsaw puzzle, going back to the start. They've now got to do a lot of work post-maturation that is going to be focused on, let's say, for example, strength work. That is typical. I'm talking from the soccer world as well. Lower leg strength, hugely important, 15, 16 years plus, right? To be able to sustain higher tempo games, etc., etc. So you've got to be thinking, what does that swimmer who's hitting their developmental milestones earlier now need to do from 15, 16? That does not necessarily mean train harder. It means the caution there is you don't want the deleterious effects. You want to be optimally developing them for what they are and where they are. Likewise, so that doesn't mean disadvantaging or doing something, it means what is right for them at that developmental stage. The later maturer, does it mean that they're good or bad? No, it just means at the moment we are seriously underestimating their developmental trajectory. We're not considering that some of those swimmers could be very highly skilled. They just can't have a competitive situation and experience where we can see those skills come to the fore because they're always behind these guys here. But what we have to do is make sure that what they're doing right there is going to be probably different and benefiting to them. And then when they do get to here, which is for these guys is probably going to be 17, 18 years old, what they need to do is just going to be done at a different time point compared to the early maturers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just thought I'd add, like one of the best things that you shared with me years ago was using the peak height velocity stuff. And in its simplest form that I took away was looking after the early maturers with aspects to injury. I remember you told me about during the peak height velocity where the range is for the highest risk of injury during their growth and during their development. I don't know if you want to share that, because that was amazing for me when you told me.
Yeah. So look, there's a tendency, and we all do it, and we see this a lot in a lot of sports, which is because that athlete is looking good early, we start to invest in them, we start to expose them, they get selected, they're playing in multiple sports, they're doing playing at multiple levels, their training and competition regimes are going through the roof. They are not being managed either within the sport or across the sports. You have to be very careful of this kind of athlete. Also, because when they're going through their peak growth phase, their bones are growing, in particular their lower limbs to start with, the femur is growing, and we're starting to see stretching of the muscle. The muscles actually look taut and thin, ligaments are being stretched, and the bone ends are starting to, the calcifying and the cartilage is starting to form, etc. In those times of peak growth, we're seeing a lot of vulnerability to injury, either from overexposure injuries, which is one source of problem. Secondly, then to external blows. That won't occur in swimming, of course, but certainly if you're doing in the gym sort of stuff, you've got to be very careful with technique, and particularly if you're doing upper body stuff, lifting weights, etc. There's all sorts of strength and conditioning recommendations out there on what you should be doing, particularly in those growth phases. And there is actually a lot of recommendations to limit training hours, exposure hours, and make sure we're not overtraining in that period, because we're going to see an injury, possibly, and the likelihood of things like ACLs, ligament injuries are going to be at their highest risk in that period. 1 year pre, let's say 1 year pre, 1 year post peak height velocity. And that's the last thing that a developing athlete wants at 15, 16 years of age, is a serious injury like that, because it will not only slow their progress and development, their involvement, they'll go backwards for a year, and it'll take 2 years then to get back to where everyone else has been developing. Does that help, Andrew?
Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that when you first explained that to me, it was one of the best things you told me. And also what I found was actually passing this on to the kids as well at certain ages, actually explaining this to them. They're equipped to handle it, understanding peak height velocity, and also what the implications are and how to look after themselves. I found it a really good self-awareness tool for the kids. Yeah,
and managing load in sport, right? Because 15, 16, it's also that time when there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of selection is going on in those different areas. So 14, 15, 16, a lot of selection, a lot of offerings, a lot of chance to get a little bit exposure and differentiation. So you're attracted by the sports system to get into it. But all that is also the time of possible highest vulnerability to injury. Yeah. Is there any other questions?
I think
Sorry if I missed anyone.
One observation from me, Steve, is that I think more than ever, coach communication, coach education, and your own personal skills and parent education as well is so vital at this point, isn't it? Because when you've got your early developers, your early maturers that think they are better, it gives them the wrong evidence, doesn't it? you know, in that, you know, we all get better and our self-esteem builds and all that's through evidence, and they're getting evidence of I'm a great athlete, when in actual fact there may not be. There may be, but there may not be. And so I think that's why it's really important for our communication skills, so that when we are dealing with these early developers, that we're not squashing it. We're not squashing the that advantage in terms of maturity that they've got, but equally to let them know that they've got a hell of a job to do, because people will be coming at them really quickly in a couple of years' time, and they're going to need to be able to deal with that psychologically, and also try and get ahead of the game in terms of learning the kind of skill traits that we would expect from adults, you know, and you know, really trying to develop additional skills probably over and above what you would expect of athletes of that age, because we know that that's going to slow down pretty quick, pretty sharpish. And then equally the communication on the other side for the late developers are to explain this to them well and let them know that just because they may well be 3 or 4 years down in terms of times on the board doesn't mean that they're bad athletes, you know.
That's right.
And that, you know, to let them understand that, you know, because as adults, I think we probably learn, you know, perhaps not to compare ourselves so much to other people, but I think as for teenagers, it's their best hobby, isn't it? It's all they do is compare themselves to other people. And so I think it's so important that we're educating the parents, we're educating the swimmers, and that our communication skills are great, so that we can set expectation levels right to make sure that we're applying the right sort of narrative with this.
Yeah, and I think this is why this procedure works really well, because you need a lot of people say, well, that's your opinion, or parents will fall into, yeah, but my Joe is really good, or whatever. But when you show them the data and you show them the dynamics in the change in where you're at, you know, what adjustment does, and we know motivationally for the kids who are developmentally behind, we know that has a real powerful effect for them. But likewise, if you show that data, and I'm sure the wiser, of course, folk who understand would get this once you've explained them to, would go, okay, and here's the data that shows you that, then it becomes more powerful, because, oh, right. And it's coming from a place where there's information that clearly states it, as opposed to you having that one-to-one conversation. Well, things are going to change pretty quick, you know. It makes it a bit more powerful.
Yeah.
The only thing I was just going to, unfortunately, just sort of say at the end, and I said a shameless plug, I'll carry on taking questions, no problem. Just to let you know that everything that we've said tonight and everything we've discussed, me and Shaun, has been published. So we have got publications, book chapters, papers published in various journals that you can gladly have a look at, or we can gladly give you the list that if you want to, if you're interested in this stuff. And likewise, a few textbooks that I've got to promote, because this is where we get a lot of coach engagement. And so my colleagues as well, Joe and Jorg in Germany, Joe's out in Canada. We've written a couple of textbooks around this. So I just want to mention those, to be fair to them.
No, that's fantastic, Stephen. And with regard to those textbooks, is there a good starting point, or do all three have the information, or is it one where we need to go from one to the other in our own education?
The one on the right is our first one, which was 2012. It's more orientated toward coaches. The second edition is on the left, and it's again more orientated towards coaches, practitioners, and it's got a chapter dedicated on what we've talked about tonight, about these developmental differences from a maturational point of view. The one in the middle is more for those folks who've got more of a sports science background, and they're interested in the research and a bit more of the research angle. So I would say that probably, depending on your audience and your interests, which text might be preferred. So if you want the more updated applied version, go for the one on the left. If you want the more research orientated version, go for the one in the middle.
No, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. I'll certainly be buying that. This has been absolutely fantastic. Fantastic. Guys, Paul Robbins, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wondered if Steve could just say a bit about proprioception and whether that was taken into account in this age spurts, or is it just okay?
Yeah. So, Paul, good point. So, proprioception in terms of awareness of body positions, either a limb or an ankle level, general awareness is something that we haven't looked at as part of explicitly or talked about tonight. But interestingly enough, we have just been doing a study looking at what is happening with kids as they go through their growth spurt. So is there an effect on movements, or is there an effect on proprioception? And we're just getting into that now. So I won't say too much right now because we haven't published it. But we are writing something up. Sean's probably biting at the bit to say something about it because Sean's been involved in it and doing that study. So that's great. But certainly from other studies, there is, and some of my former colleagues here, Roger Adams and co, would certainly say that proprioception, the awareness of positions or ranges of positions in a joint or across joints, is associated with skill level. And again, that if you have someone who's been very involved in a lot of movement activities from in different ways, in different movement patterns, let's say taking the knee to different positions and taking different forces out of it in lateral lunging movements, etc. If you stimulate all those movements in lots of different ways, in lots of different activities, then it's likely that you've got a young athlete who is more kinesthetically aware or proprioceptively aware. However, if you've got someone who hasn't exposed, but is just used to doing things in straight lines and in one plane of movement, you might have got someone who's got an awareness at one degree of level, you might say, but limited knowledge and proprioception for other positions of the body.
Thanks, Stephen. So, just say it's been a fantastic session you've run there. Congratulations to all of you.
No, thanks, Paul. Look, thanks very much for the feedback, and again, happy to chat and continue chatting with folks. Brilliant,
guys. I've got a couple of questions, but before I start, has anybody else got anything else they'd like to ask?
Just for Paul as well. Did you see Rick Charlesworth and Andrew's session on here on the network? Because they talk a little bit about proprioception and awareness as part of motor skill development.
I'm pretty sure you was on, Paul, wasn't you, on that one?
Yeah. Yes, I was. It was that's what raised my interest, because it's we going back to what I said to Steve, we tend to talk about the physical aspects a lot of the time, and nothing wrong with that, but the cognitive development tends to get left behind. And I think the cognitive structures and the way that young swimmers handle their body, we tend to talk in a different language to them. We ought to be going down to their level and speaking in their own language when we educate them.
A very good practical strategy, Paul, that a bit like a paradigm that my colleague Roger used, was essentially getting people into positions, but doing it blindfolded or taking sensory awareness away from them. And just then saying, okay, tell me what angle your knee's at. So if you're in a squat position, what's the angle of your hip and your back? What do you think? Draw me the shape that you think you're in, or show me, and do little challenges like that. In the lunge position, how far, what degree is your knee bent in your lunge? And then you actually show them the video. Yeah. And that is just simple. Loads of trials like that is a good way of giving them some feedback. And for swimming, it's got to be this kind of stuff, right? So yeah, even on dry land, you can do some very simple things to sense where the awareness is. But of course, it's more complicated than that when you're in the water and you're talking about positions, elbow positions, etc. But that's where video comes in, because you know, as you know, you can say till you're blue in the face that your elbow's not this or the delivery's not that, but they don't know what you mean until they see it, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well done, thanks.
No worries, Paul.
Great stuff. Great stuff. One of the questions I had for you, Stephen, and this is more of an application thing, but we discussed earlier on about the fact that, you know, with the male development, it tends to be positive things pretty much with every development, every phase of the development, you know, so it's increased strength, it's increased cardiovascular ability, you know, increased limb length, all that type of stuff, all stuff that's really positive for specifically for the sport of swimming. But then when it comes to obviously female athletes with the difficulties that a lot of those girls face when it comes to power to weight ratio, and obviously, you know, with the effects that they have when they're developing, you know, and one of the things that, you know, I don't know whether it's just an old school thing, you know, that's been passed on through the generations or whatever, is that we need to start pushing the female athletes a lot earlier before they start with that phase, so that phase lengthens out. You know, so rather than in the general population, you know, we've often seen female athletes, you know, if they have a few months off, they come back like women. You know, they've gone away like little girls and they come back like women within the space of 2 or 3 months. It's so quick. And often I've found that, you know, but if those girls are training really, really hard, quite aerobically from a young age, that period of time often lengthens out, and so they don't have the massive growth spurts and you know the weight gains that happens more in a linear way rather than all of a sudden. Is that just a kind of old wives' tale thing, or is there any facts that you've studied that actually backs that up?
I think there's certainly training effects for sure, and of course, and there's a research that's been done by guys in Canada and guys in the UK that have shown, certainly, I mean, this was many years ago and some of it more recent, showing that, you know, intensive training will have both positive and possibly negative effects, but the point of which it becomes negative, you have to be careful of, because you don't want to be talking about massive weight loss, you know, energy deficiencies, etc.
Yeah, of course.
But certainly in terms of keeping lean and of course aerobic capabilities, and you're thinking cross-country runners, etc. The sustained training effects over time will over extended periods of time will certainly offset against what you might say what would have been a different trajectory, right? So it is possible, yes, but you've got to be careful that might not be injurious or leading to some of those negative consequences. So for cross-country runners, loss of bone mineral density, etc., because that causes all sorts of problems down the line. Gymnasts the same, etc. Whether the idea of doing things earlier, like a lot of aerobic work, get where you're going with it, because it might maintain the leanness of body shape, which might be very important in the water, of course. But strength, and we know that, for example, on a normal trajectory, strength gains relative to weight gain is lower in females. The actual change in height is not as profound. So height accumulation is slower and smaller. Not slower, it's smaller. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shaun. So the magnitude of change is going to be less. But whether then you intervene with, let's say, strength training is an idea. Some people have spoke about that, and other changes. But again, I'm speaking more off what I know, but not what's explicit in the papers, and I can't really comment in detail. You know what I mean?
That's understandable. Yeah, I mean, just really interesting little things like, you know, because I was in a lucky position at my last club where we, you know, 75% of our athletes came through the system, and then maybe 25% of the good ones came late. And it's interesting that, you know, we started dry land training with our young kids at 9, 10, 11, and it was just body weight stuff, you know, running, catching, you know, press ups, you know, body weight stuff. And interestingly, the female athletes that started that stuff, including pull-ups, if they got into it while they were undeveloped, then they had no problem keeping those strength gains up during the puberty phase, you know, during that phase where the bodies were changing. They didn't lose strength. Whereas quite often, if I had a swimmer that came to me, say at 16, that had never done that strength stuff and they'd gone through that puberty phase and put that naturally put weight on, in some cases they never could catch it up. There was, you know, no matter how hard we tried, there was a number of athletes that just never were able to even do one pull-up. Whereas those that had started it young and done it all the way through that phase actually maintained the strength levels, and they didn't have the same deficit that often happens, you know, when the girls are going through that really quick maturation phase. And equally, the girls that were already doing a relatively large aerobic component to their training program, so they were probably already training at least for an hour or two every day in the pre-teens, that they avoided those big performance dips when they went into the full maturation phase and straight afterwards. And so it's just interesting that, again, I've never particularly read any research on it, but it's just anecdotal from what I've seen the last 20 years of coaching at Sheffield.
Yeah. It's a hard one. It's a hard one because I can't, off the top of my head, explicitly recall specific information that would make a claim specifically against those things. But I'm certainly sure that a strength and conditioner or a physiologist would give some insight on what. But again, there's multiple components you have to consider in that conversation.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Fundamental skill, but also then existing strength, pre-existing strength. What's their previous experience in moving in those areas, doing weights, etc. Even from 10, 12. But certainly there's a definite link between those who've done a lot of aerobic training pre-maturation and have been involved in a lot of activities, different activities. They're certainly going to more likely have a better developmental trajectory going into post-puberty and being able to sustain with training loads, etc. Post that, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Ryan Livingston, are you on? I see your name on. Are you listening, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm on, Russ, yeah.
What's your thoughts? Mate, you've read every book that's ever been written. So what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm not sure my expertise would necessarily be this, Russ, but certainly from a skill development perspective, I think we'd probably all agree that has to be the foundation of everything, not just in swimming, but it's generally considered to be the limiting factor in all sports. A couple of points that have come up that I think have resonated with me is certainly around this idea of aerobic development. And I think something Bill used to say, Bill Sweeten, was that it has to be skilled aerobic work. So I sometimes have this discussion with coaches around the importance of aerobic work. Well, it's only worth doing if it's done correctly. So, use the longest repeat distances that the athlete can maintain technique for. So from a practical point of view, which I think is what coaches always want, I think that's quite a good thing to work by. Regarding the long-term athlete development stuff or the bio banding and the maturation rates, I think in club programs, more than anything, what we need to have is an awareness. So, attending presentations like this becomes really important because we might not have the resources to necessarily take any of these measurements if we don't have a physio or an S&C or a sports science support. But, I think it's been mentioned a few times, like we can see these changes, like we can see when the athletes come in, we can see if they've grown, we can see if they, might have gained weight in a period of time where they've been off. And so even if you have an awareness of these things, like you're already at a bigger advantage compared to somebody else. And just one really important point, I think, is to educate parents and swimmers. You know, if we can educate them before it becomes an issue, you know, on progression rates, you know, so something we'll do is we'll graph the performances of senior international athletes that have come through the program and what their progression was like at certain times, where they plateaued, what the strategies we put in place to avoid those plateaus. So I think all of that kind of stuff, if you can address that before it becomes an issue, I think that the buy into the whole program's going to be a lot better.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Ryan. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you.
Anybody else got any points, any questions?
Yeah, just a quick one, Russ. It's been mentioned a few times about the development of energy systems and things, and but also how skill is important. I'm just wondering, is the way that we discuss them the wrong way round? Is it, if we work skills well enough and hard enough, we will work the aerobic system, as opposed to we need to train the aerobic system with good skills? Do you see what I mean? Might be just playing with words a little bit, but as for me, it's like a mindset of, if I work skills well enough and hard enough, then that's going to allow the individual to kind of work with what they're given to problem solve, and through that, then they're going to work at different intensities, which could be
I can jump in here for you, Andrew. So one of some of the most consistent definitions of skill is being able to perform, obviously, consistently in a consistent way with maximum certainty, but also with minimal energy expenditure, or in other words, efficiency or economy in other contexts. So, and a fundamental driver of human movement, whenever you're doing movement, I mean, imagine you're chasing something over the prairie lands. If you've got to track an animal for your food, you want to be able to do that efficiently so that you can either run further if you need to, or be able to do other tasks afterward, after you've done your run. And so that's a fundamental driver in a lot of human movement. But how we solve those problems and how we get to that solution, well, some of us might get there, some of us might not, depending on whether we solve it ourselves or whether we need coaching and some skill acquisition work to do it. But fundamentally, as we're driving skill, movement pattern into its groove, let's say, a fundamental driver is to drive the energy cost down with it, so to become more efficient. So we've actually talked about efficiency tonight as being able to cover greater distance with less propulsive force, essentially, right? And that is what you're striving for. So it's part and parcel. They're two components of the same thing, right?
Yeah, I think it relates back to what Rick and I spoke about a little bit. Just looking at the skill being like you said, if we can find efficiency, then I should be able to swim longer and further. So then I can handle more volume. So then the volume kind of comes in as the secondary component, but we all know that we need it, if you know what I mean.
It was interesting. It was interesting that Bill brought in a concept called the individual check-in speed. I don't know if you remember that, where he talked about that a basic aerobic pace, a starting point for anybody that didn't have any sports science support, a starting point for somebody, to make sure they're working at a good aerobic level would be the 100 PB plus 15 seconds, but with a sustained stroke count. So making sure that it wasn't just a heart rate, we weren't just, or a time that we're focusing on. It was a heart rate, time at a given distance per stroke, which is, obviously a really good indicator of stroke efficiency. And I certainly did a real lot of that in the early days when I was coaching, teens and pre-teens. That when we were doing aerobic work, we used that as the benchmark as 100 PB plus 15. When we monitored that effort level with the heart rate monitors, it was corresponding usually to about 50, 60 beats below max, which on most estimates is fat burning zone, moderate level aerobic. But I made sure that within that, they had to count the strokes. and also a coaching tool would be to actually start to ask them to start to drop the stroke count and try and get some more distance per stroke. And so within that, you've got all elements, haven't you? You know, you've got the energy system work, and you've got the skill enforcement with the stroke counting as well. And I found that really useful, you know, because it wasn't just plowing up and down mindless aerobic mileage. It was actually with a purpose.
Can I just follow that again, Russ?
Yeah, good.
Andrew, I think you're absolutely right. I think we've got it the wrong way around. If I was coaching 14 and unders again, I don't think the terms aerobic, anaerobic, threshold, A1, A2, lactate this, lactate that would be in my vocabulary. I don't think I'll be planning my program based around those parameters. I think it would all be form based in terms of, you know, are we doing swim, or are we doing kick, or are we doing pull, or are we doing starts, and then there's obviously going to be a technical focus or skill focus around those things. You know, the amount of coaches that I see that are doing, you know, a lactate threshold set, for example, but the kids with the best will in the world, you know, can't really swim.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right with that. I think, you know, we've got it back to front, and an aerobic or any energy system development is specific to the task. So if you're not swimming correctly, you know, we're not going to get the main benefits from it anyway. Okay, so certainly I think, yeah, I would actually absolutely agree with that.
Certainly in the teenage years where they're still getting the benefit of growth and that type of thing. I think certainly from experience, once you've lost that huge improvement curve that happens after the growth phase, you know, you really are looking for 1%ers after that. And at that point, you know, you need to start looking more at energy systems and at maintaining skills that have been learned as a teenager, but then, you know, making sure you're working the right energy system so that you are getting the adaptations that you need to get the macro cycle by macro cycle improvements. But certainly, without a doubt, as I think as age group coaches, which 95% of us are, I think you're on it. I think you're absolutely on it. I think you're right.
Can I just make a point there? Sorry, lads. And very interesting.
Brian is back.
Now it's more the fundamental principle of progressive overload, and at some level we are when the kids hit this growth spurt, for example, and things like coordination and the ability to move fluidly through the water change, invariably there's too many people default to more work, but it's not very purposeful work, which is exactly what you said. So it's whether there's physical challenges and a rationale to regress some of the work to correct some of the physical gaps and then reload again, if that makes sense. Your point around a kid who can't do a bodyweight chin up at pre-maturation, you know, are you better off spending time focusing and concentrating on strength development work out of the water before trying to allow them to swim if it's impacting their stroke efficiency in the water because they don't have the strength?
That's a really interesting point, Brian. And I can remember a great conversation that I had with Kev Renshaw. It was one of the people I respect most highly. And he was talking about when he first started coaching Molly Renshaw. And she was already obviously way past post-maturation when he took her on. And he said that she had real strength issues and that she could hardly do a press up or a pull up. And so that he took her out of the water and only did one session a day in the water for a long period of time, so that he could actually retrofit strength before then so he took her right back down to 30 odd K a week to retrofit the strength before he built the mileage back up again in the pool. And that was a choice that he made. And without a doubt, the performances that she's had recently would never have happened if he didn't make that choice a number of years ago.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the coaching relationship piece then, if you're a young athlete who's evidently frustrated with having to relearn new movements and having to redefine how things are happening in the water, and largely some of the responses from coaches are, we need to do more, harder, faster, longer, whatever it would be. And it isn't the right thing for a lot of people to do. The stimulus needs to be fundamentally different to help them bridge that gap of when they hit that physical change, if you like, and psychologically, those things are all linked together, because there's a lot of kids who end up in the sport really good, really young. They don't know how they got there. They don't know why they ended up getting there. They just turned up and they can swim pretty quick, and they enjoy training because it defines them and being successful. And then when they hit any little hiccup en route, if the underpinning basics haven't been well grounded, you have a real challenge emotionally and psychologically rebuilding an individual who judges themselves based on their performance in the sport. So sorry, I'm rattling on there, but
no, that's a really good point, Brian. And sometimes you can never get them back, can you?
No, and I mean their confidence in themselves, because the early stage progression has been, and again, it's based on experience. You look at them, you know you've got something to work with, but you still have to be patient and careful around how it grows and how it develops. And now, I mean, we've all seen kids, even this week, we got about Monday, and you mentioned it earlier, they go away as little girls, they come back as women. And I'm going, oh man, you've got to start that all over again. And on the boys' side, it'll take a bit more time, but they don't seem to have the same, they don't judge it. Maybe they have a bit more patience. Maybe you can work with them in a slightly different way. They'll enjoy the gym, whereas some of the other issues you have with the females maybe are fundamentally different.
I think just from there, some great comments there by Brian on extrapolating what those issues are when you see that big progression early on, and you get fallen into that trap of, oh, this is it. Let's pile on the progression overload sort of principles. When you've just, and this is why I flicked this slide back up, because as you've rightly said, hold on a minute, you've got to be careful, because you do that in that wrong time when they've just gone through their growth spurt. One, it's a biologically driven process, and now you're just about to expose it to injury if you're not careful, particularly if you haven't got all the technique right and the injury prevention stuff in there. And so what the conversation you've done there, Brian, is really done well in bringing back this framework and what Russ was saying, to sort of rethink about where you go next and what you do next, given the stage of development of the kind of person you've got in front of you.
Absolutely.
I just got a comment on there from Sarah about, was there any reason that studies were done using male subjects, not female? I should say, all of the data we've got presented tonight is generally, we tried to stick it around 100 meter freestyle, just as a general thing, but we have got data on females, equivalent data, which I'm happy to sort of discuss, but we've also got longitudinal tracking data in females as well.
Great stuff. Guys, I'm conscious that we've taken 2.5 hours of your time. This has been like the quickest 2.5 hours of my life. I think it's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. It's set my mind going in all sorts of directions with applications and how we can practically put this in place. So unless anybody's got any last questions, can I give a really warm thank you for your time, Steve, for your time, Shaun, and for your input, Andrew, and without a doubt, one of the best sessions we've ever done. So thanks. I really appreciate everything you've shared with us today.
No, pleasure. And like I said, happy to chat.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Great stuff. Thanks, everybody.